Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive topic. We're demystifying North Korea. Look, for decades, this place has been locked away behind insanely strict borders, totally isolated from the outside world. But beyond all those sensational headlines, what's actually going on? Using our source material, we're going to break the whole thing down, the history, the politics, and the actual day-to-day society of this incredibly guarded nation.
Okay, let's dive into this. What is the grounded, actual reality of North Korea? Because, let's be honest, you've seen the documentaries, you've heard the wild rumors. Some people paint it as this terrifying military powerhouse, while others describe it as a nation literally frozen in time. Well, in this explainer, we're going to separate the internet myths from the hard facts. We want to really understand the true foundation of the country, and, more importantly, the lives of the people inside. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the origins of a divided nation. Then, we'll cover daily life and struggles, followed by the military-first policy. After that, we'll unpack propaganda and myths, and finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the future. All right, starting us off with Section 1, Origins of a Divided Nation. Now, to really understand North Korea's intense isolation today, we absolutely have to rewind and look at its geopolitical origins right after World War II. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how it happened. After the war, the Korean Peninsula was split right down the middle. In 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, was officially established. You had the Soviet Union backing a communist government in the north and the United States backing the south. And as you might guess, by 1950, those immense geopolitical tensions just exploded into the Korean War. The fighting finally stopped in 1953 when an armistice was signed. But wait, here's the absolute critical piece of the puzzle you need to understand. That 1953 armistice, it was just a ceasefire. It was not a formal peace treaty. So, technically speaking, North and South Korea are still at war today, right now. They're separated by the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, which is this incredibly heavily fortified border. And it's this ongoing, unresolved conflict that really forms the absolute bedrock of North Korea's whole isolationist posture and their super defensive mindset. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this state of perpetual conflict laid the exact groundwork for how the country is run. One of the wildest things about North Korea is this multi-generational transfer of power, which has been going on for over 70 years now. The state's founder, Kim Il-sung, set up a system that merged communism with an incredibly intense personality cult. When he died in 1994, power went straight to his son, Kim Jong-il, and then later to his grandson, Kim Jong-un. The state places an extraordinary emphasis on these heroic personality cults and demands absolute loyalty to the leaders. I mean, their portraits are literally everywhere, and citizens are taught from a very early age to view them as their ultimate national protectors. Moving on to Section 2, Daily Life and Struggles. Zooming inside the borders, let's take a look at the tight grip the state actually has over the everyday lives of its people. There's a stark contrast between their domestic network and the global internet we all use. Basically, most citizens only get access to a heavily restricted domestic intranet. This lets the government completely control the narrative. The actual global internet, it's totally banned for almost everyone, which entirely blocks out any foreign influence. By completely controlling TV, radio, and computer networks, the state basically builds a firewall against outside information. And it's not just digital. Even travel inside the country is heavily monitored. You often need official permission just to travel from one city to another. But what's day-to-day life actually like? Well, the government loves to project this image of uniform prosperity, but the reality on the ground is a whole different story, and it heavily depends on where you live. In the capital city, Pyongyang, you definitely see greater investment and much better living standards. It's kind of the showpiece. But out in the rural areas, it's a really tough situation. Citizens face frequent electricity shortages and crushing poverty. And sure, education and healthcare are officially free, provided by the state, but the actual quality of those services varies wildly, depending on whether you're in a privileged area or out in the countryside. Now, to truly grasp their economic situation today, we have to look back at a devastating tragedy. Back in the 1990s, North Korea went through one of the worst famines in modern history. It was basically a perfect storm. The Soviet Union collapsed, which wiped out their main economic support. Add to that massive floods destroying crops and some extremely poor agricultural policies, and you get a disaster where hundreds of thousands of lives were tragically lost. To survive, everyday people were forced to start relying on informal underground markets. And here's why this really matters for us today. Those informal markets didn't just disappear when things stabilized. They are still super active and play a surprisingly huge role in the country's economy right now. That brings us to Section 3, the military first policy. Let's zoom back out to the global stage, because we need to talk about the core of the nation's really controversial posture, the military first policy. North Korea actually has a pretty small population, but despite that, they maintain one of the largest standing armies in the entire world. Why? Well, it's because the state views military strength, and specifically we're talking about missiles and nuclear weapons here, as absolutely essential for their survival. It's their ultimate insurance policy. So this policy drives massive amounts of money and resources into weapons testing, which, as we all know, frequently sparks intense international tension and results in some really heavy economic sanctions from the rest of the world. When we talk about these nuclear weapons, it's important to objectively understand the two very different perspectives at play here. From the North Korean government's point of view, these weapons are a completely necessary deterrent. They argue that nukes provide the essential security and defense they need against foreign threats. But on the flip side, critics view this nuclear program as a massive drain on resources. They argue that all that money could and should be used to improve the impoverished living conditions of ordinary citizens, and that building these weapons just ramps up global conflict and instability.
Next up, Section 4, Propaganda and Myths.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how North Korea deliberately presents itself to the outside world, and why it's so incredibly tricky for us to separate fact from fiction. Think about the footage you usually see of North Korea on the news. It's almost always these massive, perfectly synchronized events, grand military parades, and pristine state media broadcasts, right? Well, these are incredibly carefully organized, highly choreographed celebrations. They are specifically engineered to highlight military achievements and the greatness of the leaders. The whole point is to project this perfectly powerful, unified, and positive image to everyone watching from the outside. And honestly, even if you travel there yourself, that veil stays firmly in place. Believe it or not, thousands of tourists actually visit North Korea, but the reality of that trip is heavily restricted. You are absolutely required to have official guides with you at all times. You have to follow strict rules. You're only allowed to visit carefully curated historical monuments. Your photography is totally restricted, and your chances of interacting with an ordinary citizen, basically zero. So yes, tourism happens, but it is deeply managed to make sure that perfectly curated image never slips. Because of all this extreme secrecy, we run into a massive problem with how we perceive the country from the outside. Online misinformation spreads like wildfire and easily distorts the reality of the situation. Look, we know for a fact that there are serious, well-documented human rights concerns and incredibly strict societal rules there. But not every crazy, sensational claim you see popping up on social media is actually true. A lot of those viral stories are totally exaggerated or just straight up false. So I really want to emphasize to you guys, as focused learners, how absolutely critical it is to rely on verified, credible sources. We have to separate the real truth from the viral rumors when we're studying this region. And finally, Section 5, the future. We've looked at the past, we've looked at the present, but what on earth happens next in such an unpredictable and isolated place? So the crucial point is understanding the underlying tension between two very different potential paths. On one hand, you have the potential for gradual reform. Analysts actually point to some limited signs of modernization, like a bit of tech development and the continued hum of those informal markets we talked about earlier. But balanced right against that is their long historical pattern of maintained control. Time and time again, the government has prioritized the stability of the regime and strict control over the population above literally everything else. That makes any sort of significant political change highly uncertain. As we start to wrap up this explainer, here's the big takeaway I really want you to leave with. To truly understand North Korea, you have to look right past those sensational headlines, past the grand military parades, and past the nuclear ambitions. When you look beyond the stereotypes of secrecy and power, what you find is a really profound story of survival and identity. Hidden right behind those heavily fortified borders are millions of ordinary people, just living their lives that mostly remain totally unseen by the rest of the world. Which leaves us with this final, lingering question to ponder. As the decades continue to pass, will North Korea eventually open its doors, finally embracing the global community? Or will it remain completely frozen in time, forever hidden behind the veil? Keep asking those hard questions and definitely keep relying on credible sources as you explore the incredibly complex future of the Korean Peninsula. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.